So, welcome to yet another PoSoCoMeS seminar. Um, Today, we're talking about Neringa Klumbytė's book entitled Authoritarian Laughter, Political Humor, and Soviet Dystopia in Lithuania. The book was published by Cornell University Press in 2023. Before starting our discussion, I'll just briefly present the author, the book, and the discussants. So Neringa Klumbytė is professor of anthropology and Russian and post-Soviet studies and director of the Lithuania program at the Havenhurst Center for East European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Miami University. She is the author of Authoritarian Laughter, Political Humor, and Soviet Dystopia in Lithuania. That's the book we're discussing today, which is the winner of the British Association for Slavonic and East European Studies Women's Forum Prize. First discussant today is Jogilė Hemment. She is a professor of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's an anthropologist and ethnographer who works in post-socialist Russia. Her research interests include gender, youth, and civil society, and feminist, participatory, and collaborative methodologies. Her two books, Empowering Women in Russia, Aid, NGOs, and Activism, and Youth Politics in Putin's Russia, Producing Patriots and Entrepreneurs, result from the ethnographic project she enacted in collaboration with Russian feminist scholar activists. I will be the second discussant for the seminar. I'm associate professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science of Vilnius University. I have PhD in political science, and my research focuses on populist discourse, populist conception of political representation, and I currently work on memory studies, narrative analysis, and the sociology of emotions to analyze memory of post-communist transformation. And today we'll be discussing the book called Authoritarian Laughter, Political Humor, and Soviet Dystopia in Lithuania. Artists, writers, and journalists were required to create state-sponsored Soviet humor and serve the Communist Party after Lithuania was incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940. Neringa Klumbytė investigates official attempts to shape citizens into Soviet subjects and engage them through a culture of popular humor. So now we'll continue with presentation of the book. Neringa, screen is yours.
Thank you, Jogilė. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be part of this seminar series. And thank you, Julia, of course, and Jogilė for being discussants for this book. So I will start from kind of a little bit of prehistory, how this project came into existence. And I was interested myself in political participation in authoritarian regimes and what is happening when one state becomes occupied by the other. So of course we know that some get killed, many others flee the country, or they are deported into exile. Still others are terrorized into silence. But when you live for 50 years in occupation, you still engage with that power. And I was fascinated to see that actually the state was able to recruit people, in a sense, into their project through laughter. And how they did that was the object of my research, because people laughed, and they not just laughed what is familiar to many of us, those who study the region unofficially, right, in the kitchens, telling those jokes against Stalin or Brezhnev, but they also laughed reading official journals. And looking at those satires or looking at the cartoons. And this was something, that the state actually intended them to do. This was a particular laughter and a particular way to laugh that the state wanted people to laugh. So this was very interesting. experiment. Humor served as a form of propaganda, and it had to be a very particular form of just try. Okay, now it's better for me because I was seeing myself onto big screen. Now I can see everybody else. So this was a particular form of humor that was allowed. So you were not supposed to laugh as you laughed before Soviets occupied Lithuania. You had to laugh in a Soviet way, and this way become Soviet subject. So a part of this humor was invented, of course, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, when they created the Soviet Union in 1922. There were lots of debates, whether Soviet humor is possible in general. Ultimately, they decided that yes, people will laugh in Soviet way. They will um, contribute to going into communism into the future, with this laughter, laughing at, lazy bureaucrats or shaming others into improvement. So in a sense, there were all kind of utopian ideas, and Lithuanian artists and editors of the Lithuanian journal embraced them, where they used to say, well, in the future, in communism, we will not need any legal structures. We could just moralize and tell people, so laughter will be that mechanism that will kind of regulate us, and this will be a peaceful, brilliant utopia. Well, not, they didn't think it's utopian. They thought this will really happen. So they promoted this kind of laughter, which couldn't be dark, couldn't be entertaining, couldn't be laughter for laughter's sake. It had to be positive. It had that moralizing aspect, and um, and it couldn't be intellectual laughter, so people had to understand it, of course, because this was a communist society. So this was the intention, and they really hope that they will be able to use that laughter for critique, for propaganda, and for kind of engineering human emotions and morals and values. And people will turn into Soviet citizens, into communist citizens, and help to govern the state this way, in a sense, and laugh together with the state. Now, what is happening, when we look at this engineering project in Lithuania, which becomes occupied in 1940, and then, Nazis came, and then in 1944, it's reoccupied by the Soviet Union itself. What we see, is kind of something that seems very paradoxical. We have this official humor journal. We have this agenda to create Soviet citizens. We have, the communist propaganda, communist humor propaganda. But at the same time, when you look, and I can show you some very old, very old journals right there. This is 1970, a Leninist issue that was destroyed. I'll tell you why if you are interested. This is another. So they create that journal in 1956, of course, during the Khrushchev thaw. Other journals existed earlier, but the Baltics were not ready. So they created only in 1956, when the Baltics is ready to laugh already in a Soviet way. And still, you open that journal, and this is something that you cannot believe, right? How could they publish that in Soviet times? That's, the sentiment that you get looking at some of these cartoons. And that was, the question that I wanted to figure it out. How was it possible? How the state was, what it seems to me in the beginning, so dumb to allow this humor. And then, how come, citizens laughed at things openly, officially, when there was censorship, when there was, KGB, when they could face all kind of problems laughing that way. So that was a big puzzle for me in the beginning to figure out. And I looked at the content. I talked to editors, artists, and writers who created for that journal. I talked to people who laughed with the journal, and they did laugh a lot. And uh, this journal was so popular that actually it did not need any subsidies like all the other Komsomol, Pravda, and the other journals that were official. They had to be subsidized by the state. So this journal even had profit and it paid for itself. And additionally, it really created something what was also interesting to me, that through that critique and through that kind of clandestine covered opposition that was there, it created something that actually contributed to the, well, kind of, to say collapse of the state, it's like a big thing to say, but contributed to the erosion, I guess that would be the right word to say. So we see here a very curious paradox. We see authoritarian state in a newly occupied territory trying to implement, the project that would appeal to people and, engineer them into Soviet citizens. And at the same time, through this official agenda, we see people, artists, editors, using humor to erode the state itself. So this was my object of study, and in this introduction, I'm not sure how much time I have. Like maybe I could take one more minute to tell you a little bit about the journal itself, what it did and how it functioned, why it was able to erode that state. So there are multiple layers that I explore, of course, like relations between those artists and editors. And I use the concept of political intimacy if they would not have trusted each other, including censors. Censors would come to those exhibitions and would say, well, so-and-so better take this cartoon off because Moscow may not understand it. So we used to imagine censors, the evil person, censoring everybody. Here we see that communication and collaboration between artists and censors. Um, uh, so, so that kind of relationship I call political intimacy. Of course, it was hierarchical. It was not equally distributed. Those political intimacies could dissipate and disappear. But so this is one way to approach why that laughter was possible. The other way is to understand the nature of laughter itself and laughter as a political phenomena, which in those classic studies of laughter, we see that, well, it's just a joke, right? Or Orwellian famous phrase, every joke is a tiny revolution. So we think it's tiny, but still not very consequential. So laughter is usually considered to be something very trivial, but it is like, it is soft power. It is a form of propaganda. And in a sense, here we see people creating their own form of communication against the state in many cases. And I call it multidirectional laughter because, we would have those cartoons in Lithuania that, and I'll try to show you one example here. We would try we would have those cartoons which would be acceptable for the state, like this one that you see. And that's why the concept of multidirectionality comes in here. So I use the concept of multidirectional laughter in order to emphasize its circulation and its reception. And through that, I see that it is ultimately political. It is about circulation of power as well. And it is something, that connected people to power and recreated that power in a sense as well. So in this cartoon, you could see, that's Kęstutis Šiaulytis cartoon, you could see that the state would be totally satisfied with, this kind of image published in the Broom because it criticizes, and critique was allowed, still occurring shortcomings. And so this is pilfering in the workplace, right? While people could generalize that to, well, all our Soviet system is rotten, right? So you really cannot control how people will perceive those jokes. And this is always, at the core of laughter. And so this is just one example. But this kind of multi-directionality and multi-meaning underlie all cartoons and many satires. And that's how, through that officially allowed venue, you can criticize still occurring shortcomings. That's the Marxist position. It had to act humor and art in general as a critique in order for the betterment of the future. So that's how it was, in a sense, creating foundation to erode its own power as such. So I'll stop here, and I believe I'll be able to go back to those cartoons and other materials to tell more if everybody's interested.
Perfect. Julie, would you like to proceed with comments and questions?
Sure. Thank you so much. So thank you first so much for the invitation to participate. This is a real pleasure to be in conversation with you all, and just a pleasure to be talking about Neringa's fantastic book in dialogue with her. So I am very appreciative of this work. I had, encountered it before this event, which was terrific, and I found it to be very useful in my own thinking. So my comments today, I've got some comments. I thought I'd structure this with some words of appreciation, comments about the contributions and some of the main concepts and, analytic contributions the book makes, as well as methodological contributions. And then I thought I'd kick off with a couple of questions just to invite Neringa to say more about this book. So thank you, first of all, for the book. It's I have really appreciated it and have drawn so much from it. It's a meticulously researched work of historical ethnography, which in itself is a really interesting contribution, both to the field that I work within, anthropology and ethnography more broadly, but also, of course, to regional studies and anybody interested in topics of memory and, contemporary society now. And it's also made profound contributions to those of us studying authoritarianism more broadly, both historically and in the contemporary moment. And that's something I want to speak to as well. So let's see, some of the top hits or things I appreciated that I think Neringa's touched on, but maybe, I'd just like to draw out a little bit. So the book deals with themes that have been so central to scholarship on post-socialism, as well as and are of incredible relevance to us today as we grapple with the challenge of rising authoritarianism globally. So questions about political agency and political responsibility, political subjectivity. So these are themes very resonant for our time. Humor is a terrific way in to explore these topics because of the sort of inherent ambiguities and instabilities with humor. A joke can, context matters enormously for a joke and the degree to which it's funny and who's laughing. Understanding and comprehension of who's inside, who's outside, etc. So it really is a very rich front from which to contemplate these questions of agency, political responsibility. Now, and this has been a very prominent set of concerns for those of us working in Russia and the Soviet Union more broadly and in post-socialist contexts. Now, what's striking about this, the selection of the Broom, so the satirical journal from Lithuania, the book takes a very kind of creative approach in looking at this public institution that was so central to Lithuanian artistic and literary life during the Soviet period, but looking at it from this angle, this set of concerns to understand the work it did and the way it functioned as, in Neringa's terms, a Soviet periphery project. So It's a wonderful object. And the book, one of the great strengths of the book is the richness of the data that it provides us with. And we've seen some of the images, we've seen some of the, the graphic design, and some of the, and via which we've gained access into some of the contestation around the meaning of these forms of cultural production. Um, so the book includes data that's been collected through this really incredible method of historical ethnography. And this is definitely something I'll invite Neringa to speak more about. So it's a combination of archival research with ethnographic methods. So there's an encountering of the archives with an ethnographic sensibility, a sort of strong, deep sense of context of the moment, ethnographic insights about the period and the conditions under which these materials were produced. But it also pivots back and forth. So from the archive prompts the path into interviews, ethnographic engagement with key actors who were involved in the production. So editors, artists, embodied encounters, interviews taken that invite these key actors to reflect on their former cultural production, on the work that they did, as well as the debates and contestation about those decisions. Some of the insights we gained from looking at those images. What was said, what were people thinking at the time, and what sense do people make of it subsequently? It also involves immersion into personal archives, right? So the ethnographic approach brought her to additional rich sources of data which weren't immediately apparent, or one would never have known about without the sort of ethnographic interviews. And also biographical material, which is so important to understand. So the personal trajectories of key players. One of the key points is another concept that's introduced in the book is the Soviet predicament. This is an interrogation of Soviet power from the periphery, and that's so important. And that is a much less well-trodden path for post-socialist studies, I think, or the anthropology of post-socialism, surely. And so some of the key works have explored these topics and themes, including humor's use, but within, say, Russia predominantly. And so this interrogation of how the project played out from the periphery, immensely important, and the biographies of the individuals to sort of trace the ways that they were positioned in relation to the Soviet project and to World War II, and the kinds of ways that key individuals who were engaged in this propaganda activity, what were the forces that put them there in the first place, and insights about their biographies that can help us make sense of the materials and the questions and the contestation in the archive, and of course the subsequent interviews. So this method I found to be really exciting and to mark a real contribution of the book, and it yielded this remarkable data. The manuscript is enhanced by the art and images selected from these archives, as well as snippets from these conversations and materials from their personal archives. So one of the questions I will build towards is to ask Neringa to speak a little bit more about this, the distinctive approach to historical ethnography that you took. I'm sure there were models there that you were drawn to emulate in part, by other anthropologists who may have done this. But clearly you took your own distinctive, you made your distinctive imprint onto this method. So that's one part of the question. The second part of the question would be just to talk to us a little bit, to share some of the challenges of this approach, which of course requires moving from past to present. You're pivoting back and forth. And it also entails being attentive to phenomena which you offer to us as analytic resources. For example, authoritarian stigma, the conditions, the discursive conditions of the present or the past 30 years, perhaps, that will inflect the ways people, your interlocutors, reflect on the materials, the contemporaneous materials that they look at. So it's a challenge. The challenge is, I would love to hear more about how you navigated the different data sets and put them together, retrospective accounts, published materials, and contemporaneous sources. I think it's a real contribution of the book, and it's just something I would love for you to share a little bit more with our audience today. Other contributions from the book. I don't want to talk too long because, of course, this is this is not. I don't want to take up too much space from this wonderful book's author. But another few contributions this makes. I mentioned the power and the importance of the project of interrogating the Soviet project from the periphery. Now, all the more important, of course, in the light of recent, current decolonizing debates that are rocking Slavic studies, especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So very important to be looking at the Soviet project from the authoritarian periphery. And that's a quote. This has been, and also engaging post-colonial theory to do that. Some of the analytic tools that are offered us are drawn from engagement with post-colonial theory. So Mbembe's work. Some of these analytic contributions that we're provided are terms and concepts that help us make sense of the ambiguities of this humor that Neringa's spoken about. So we have a set of novel analytic conceptions, multidirectional laughter being one of the most prominent. We've heard about that, that shows the ambiguities of reception of humor, which helps us interrogate the complicated forms of agency vis-a-vis Soviet power that people assumed. Also, antagonistic consensus, banal opposition, political intimacy, those are all key terms that help us make sense of these intimate experiences of authoritarianism. So these are theoretical contributions to those who are studying authoritarianism and political belonging under authoritarianism that are of terrific value. I want to just point out that the book itself, so these concepts are things that it would be lovely to hear you talk about a little bit more. And one other point, but just to say that the book itself contains really wonderful kinds of examples of how these concepts were operationalized. In my most, I looked at the book again, of course, in preparation for this event. I'd read it before, but I was struck this time at, for example, bureaucratic showcasing, right? This this wonderful coining to sort of show how to gauge, in other words, to read the archival materials and to figure out the degree to which there was actual ideological commitment or support to the project or pro forma, right? This central question, and of course the book shows us it's neither nor. It's not as simple. It's pushing against binaries. And yet there is a sifting that can be done. So it's never black or white, but there is a way in which you can read through the archives for this. And the methods box that's there sort of shows, here are some clues. Basically, here are clues of how I read this particular moment, where something's perhaps unsubstantiated by example, it suggests a more pro forma orientation. So I love that. I mean, as somebody who thinks a lot about methods and analysis, how do we do the work? So combines this appreciation and foregrounding of complexity, ambiguity, but also gives us tools to sort of sift through these things. So I love that. My favorite of these concepts is multidirectional laughter of these analytics. It's extremely good to think, both as we look historically at materials and in the contemporary moment as we confront the contemporary moment. And this is a topic that Neringa and I have been in dialogue about on before my own work looks a little bit at the harnessing of humor that's undertaken by authoritarians in the present moment, so including the Russian state, but not, of course, restricted to this context from Trump to Berlusconi, etc. This is and in the book, this is gestured too. So this is a very useful concept, I think, in terms of helping us make sense of contemporary unfolding manifestations and dynamics. Okay. So to questions. So the first one is about historical ethnography. So I've already shared that one. Basically, how you, I guess, models you were inspired to, how you thought about it, and how your thinking evolved through the course of the project, um, it, and some of the challenges of that. Second question. Oh, and actually, this is yeah. Okay. So the second question, how has your relationship to the work changed in the light of recent decolonizing discussions? I would be interested to hear you reflect on that. The terrific relevance of the work, but also where it's taken you, the Soviet predicament, how it's differentially felt, experienced, its productiveness. And how has your relationship to the material or the work shifted in general, perhaps, you know, since the events of the last couple of years and full-scale invasion? And a third question about audience. This occurred to me when you were speaking and presenting to us today. Your writing, of course, this book is published in the United States by an American university press, and one of the central preoccupations that many, that we all, I think, as ethnographers or people writing about Russia and post-socialist contexts have to grapple with is the discursive framing of the Cold War, the ways in which, dominant narratives, in other words, in the United States, and how one takes that into account also as you're writing about the Soviet past and, from the perspective of the Soviet periphery. So I wondered about that. And of course, in the contemporary moment, the goalposts have shifted again entirely.
If I could ask you to repeat the last one,
Yes,
audience.
sure.
By
Yes,
audience, I missed something.
yes. It may be the connection. I was losing you all for some of these moments. Yeah, no, I was interested. This was just a question that occurred to me while you were presenting. The question of your book was published in the United States.
Right.
So the question of, as you've had to navigate, say, authoritarian stigma with your interlocutors and how that inflects their accounts of the past, equally you have a discursive environment that you're writing within and various constructions you may be concerned to take on, bear in mind, contest, or, how you handle that. So it's a less important question, perhaps, but it's something that occurred to me as you were speaking. And of course, the conditions have changed now in recent years in terms of what the US audience is thinking about. But yeah. So anyway, thank you for the work, and I will pass to Jogilė.
Thank you, Julie, so much.
Thank you. I will continue on phrases, but also to the questions. The way I got the main idea or the main question of the book is how, and that's the quote from the book, is how authoritarian regimes become part of everyday experiences, other citizens, involve them in their political projects and make their ideologies appealing at moral, emotional, and embodied levels, or fail to restructure visions of social and everyday lives. And I really like this way of posing the question, suggesting that there are attempts to attract people which are not necessarily always successful. And I also like your focus on how those authoritarian regimes attempt to, as you say, institutionalize significant practices which have a popular appeal. So that means the book is very much focused on specific mechanisms or attempts that help establish linkage or even identification between the regime and citizens. So in answering this main research question, or trying to solve the puzzle, you present the image of really a complex tapestry, I would say, of multi-directional regulation and self-regulation. That's what you, I think, started talking about, the way everyone is related and interrelated in the close network. But if you could say more about that self-regulation or self-censorship, that would be really interesting to hear if your interlocutors were reflecting on that. And what this book also shifts focus from is from those categories such as strict control or fighting, the very important result, or what this actually book brings in is different kind of vocabulary, how we can talk about what was actually happening under authoritarian regimes. And I think it applies more broadly rather than only to media or to this particular example, especially in the late Soviet era. So this is when we talk about that multi-directional regulation and self-regulation. So this helps understand why both the government or regime, the institutions, and the opposition in the regime are called banal. It seems that the rulers were involved in that, as you say, commonplace process of participation in the authoritarian milieu, but the opposition was also within the system itself. So it seems that these distinctions in general become banal. And it also, the impression that I get from the reading the book is that everyone participating in that system structure was implicated, in a sense that everyone, editors, censors, so authorities, belong to the same network of trust, of same coexistence, of same interdependence. And that's what is described by the concept political intimacy. And I like the naming of this complex tapestry of relationships very much. And the other concept, which was already mentioned by Julie, is not less important, is multidirectional laughter, which refers both to serving and undermining regime all at once. So one of the suggestions of the book, and I find that really interesting, as you already said at the beginning, that we have that image of censorship and control in the authoritarian regime is really strict and clear and positioned in that higher level of hierarchy. But it seems here that censorship was not that powerful. So could you say a couple of words more about that? How did that happen, that they gave up that kind of power? I mean, it seems to me that in an authoritarian regime, you try to keep as much as power as you can. So why did those censors got involved in those relationships of political intimacy? And what you're saying is that instead of understanding that of repression control, it seems that censorship was inconsistent, fluctuating, and relational practice. So my question is, why? Why is that? How did that happen? And my next point, and here I sort of want to challenge you a bit, is that is that you're suggesting that the regime is establishing not only ideological regulation or control, but primarily establishes specific emotion norms, which means that, and what you're describing seems to me very similar to emotional management. That is, there is negotiation, but it seems that there are actual rules. What is allowed to be felt, towards whom, what are the limits of those emotions, and there are specific topics that you cannot really touch, but you sort of can mention them. And my idea, or I think that through this emotion governance or management, regime becomes even more efficient. So there are those norms which are not necessarily written somewhere, but they are used by everyone. That it seems that, for example, anger cannot really be expressed. So you can have some sort of resentment, mockery, especially towards those foreign enemies of ISIS, but not anger. And it seems that Broom, the magazine, socializes one into a certain emotional mode, or emotional, reader becomes under emotional regulation, what is appropriate to feel and what is not, what is inappropriate to feel. And seems that in the magazine there are emotions allowed, only those which do not pose any danger to the regime and do not pose any danger to the institutions. There are just some laughs and jeers, but it's very clear that will be no confrontation and no anger, and that you can clearly still see who are the holders of power, and that the one who laughs is the holder of actually no power. So what if you see the king naked or half naked, if all you can do about it is just laugh, or maybe you can shame him or her maybe a little bit. So one of the questions that I was thinking was, can we consider that in this case, laughter functions as a continuation of shaming? So that's the role of laughter, just to shame a bit. I wonder if informants reflected on this emotional management during interviews. So did they discuss that? Did they reflect on that? Did they think in those terms? Did they think about those allowed, not allowed emotions? And finally, I'm going to my probably last point, is that it seems that it is argued in the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Broom contributed to the creation of to that sort of imagined community, and at the same time it also contributed to a different vision of the regime. But if this created imagined community is peaceful, calm, it's mocking but patient and not resistant, does it actually pose any danger to the institutions? So one of the answers that you provide to this puzzle, which I think is one of the important puzzles of the whole book, is that the magazine, and I quote, contributed to making Lithuania's independence in the late 1980s an imaginable future for Broom readers. So it seems that the whole book revolves around this tension about who we are and what is allowed to imagine and what's not. And caricatures also serve this purpose. This graphic art created as you say, disruptions in those ideological visions. And I think the examples that you already shown, the example was really good. So it also, as you say, expressed dissensus shared by artists, writers, and readers. But then my question is, and I come back to the same question is, why do you think and why do you say that Broom was dangerous? If politicians themselves, and some you quote some of famous Lithuanian communist politicians, did not consider the magazine dangerous, would you say that they were mistaken? So if we have clear lines drawn as to what can and cannot be laughed at, and if it takes a lot of effort, a lot of hiding to include the characters in the cartoon, isn't that creating an illusion of agency here? And my final question is, could it be that humor contained is revolution contained? So I will.
Contained what?
The humor contained is revolution
Oh,
contained. Yeah.
instead of being a resistance, it was a form of containment.
Yeah. Yeah. That is when you control the limits of laughter, that you control
Okay.
revolution. So I will stop here and I'm looking forward to hearing all your insights.
Thank you very much to both. Excellent and insights and comments, and thank you. I really keep taking lots of notes. I really appreciate it. Everything is very useful. So I'll address. I have 15 minutes. I'll address Julie's comments first, and then Jogilės. So historical graffiti. So this was my invention. I was primarily trained as an anthropologist, and I have always done kind of a secret archival research, because you understand that you cannot understand things just simply looking at the present. So this was part of what I have been doing, but my sensibilities and my kind of um, wish to tell the story is very much from my own discipline. You have to understand how people live, how they function, and you have to understand complexities and totality of that. And how do you do that when you study the past? Because the past is gone. You cannot, what anthropologists usually do, they go to that community that they have questions about. They live with them, they immerse into everyday life. And this was something that I was not able to do because this was the subject that was set in the past. So what I did, kind of, partly intuitively, I was very much driven to people who could still tell me stories about what happened in the past. So I talked to artists, editors, and of course some of them were gone. Others were still around, and I was lucky to interview 11 people who worked for the journal. I believe it's 11. I have to now I have to look back at the book to remember the number, but I think it's 11. And I talked to their families. I talked to other editors, for example, journalists who worked in that time. So, of course, they were telling stories that were very much detached, right? And they were telling stories in the context of what was happening nowadays. So we know that memory is fragmented, that it's partial. I always kept that in mind when I was talking to them. But luckily, I had a lot of other materials like archives. And these archives, I sometimes laugh, that KGB archives is just such a great resource for anthropologists because they were taking such detailed notes on everything, you know. So it's like taking field notes. Of course, it's from their own perspective, but still it's field notes, you know. So you can kind of try to look through that ideological discourse. And my major kind of methodological imperative was to just juxtapose those different sets of data. And this was not just the KGB archives. KGB archives weren't that helpful. These were Communist Party archives. These were literature and art archives, which had thousands of pages of all kind of materials. So like edited journal issues. So can you imagine what a treasure was that for me? You know, you look how editors edited the journal before getting approval, and they edited with different pens, so I could then distinguish who was, you know, doing what. Then, you know, thousands of letters sent by the Broom to different institutions in order to check the data that they got, like complaints from people. And what I really, really liked was people's letters. So this kind of ties into Jogilė's question about emotions, because I read emotions not just from the journal itself. I read emotions from these letters, and there were all kind of things there. There was anger, there was dissatisfaction. So dissatisfaction was in the Broom as well, but it was controlled. It was just the way it existed. It was just through that particular idiom that it could be expressed, you know. It's not anger, but it's kind of constructive criticism, right? Socialist, in order just making, well, shaming people, of course, but shaming into improvement. It always had to have that positive kind of end point. That's what they liked. But people talked about all kind of things and how they dealt, how they responded. So those archives had people's letters and then editors' responses to people's letters. Both were sometimes very emotional. And I use some of them in the book, like, you know, why are you writing about those drunks all the time? You know, I feel I want to get drunk myself, you know that, or they, you know, or they people would complain, why don't you publish my work? And they would say, you know, just go and publish anywhere else if you want to. So in a sense, Broom had full authority, but they had that mandate of the state. In a sense, they had a mandate to be more critical than any other journal. So that was their particular mandate. And in that sense, they were exceptional. They overstepped, you know, this, what was permissible from time to time. They were reprimanded, you know, they were censored, but editor was still able not to lose his job for many, many years. He worked basically 30 years, 29 and some, in the Broom, which also shows how well established he was and how well he was able to navigate, you know, that Communist Party and Central Committee waters. So, so in those, that was very curious communication, people's letters. They would say, you know, what we see here, you know, you will never see in a communist country. Or, you know, they would express openly nationalistic sentiments. And the Broom editors would say, and I talk about this in the chapter on political aesthetics, they would disregard it. They would say, well, this is cheap humor. They would not say this is, you know, unacceptable nationalistic sentiments. So from those letters, in a sense, I also learn, you know, how they related to the materials, how they related to everyday life as well. So this was something that was very, very valuable in my research. And also just, you know, trying to imagine, reimagine, kind of feel that past as much as possible through talking to those artists, for example, visiting their summer homes. Some of them were not changed from Soviet times, you know, and it's interesting, you know, how that neoliberalism can conserve, even social layers. It's not just archaeological layers, but also social layers, because nobody became very rich. They still have the same stuff, that they used to have. And I was like, with Juozas Bulota, the son of the main editor, I used to ask him, so how about this thing? Was it here? Oh yeah, this is one of those boars that my father killed, and that's the fur that we still have it here. So I was sitting at the table of the editor-in-chief with his son, looking for 3 weeks, looking at, things that were not touched for 30 years. From his suitcases in that, and that kind of helped me to, well, you are the judges, you can tell how much I succeeded. Also, you always have to have that critical positionality, and try to understand interview materials, also Communist Party archives, also what people wrote, because they also could write just in a particular way. And yeah, and interviews. So, well, the book is kind of a testimony of what I was able to succeed. But the kind of those imperatives, Julie asked a very important question, who served as models for me? And I wish, somebody could write about historical ethnography methodology explicitly. None of those who wrote, about the past and were anthropologists, for the Catherine Berdery on Doug Rogers, they don't talk about that explicitly. They just do that ethnography of the past, or Bruce Grant, they don't really tell, how to, what's the model that they are using. So I tried to do it to some extent, but I didn't have well-articulated models to follow. I just knew their examples, the written examples that existed. And my own is basically, just very much critical reading, a lot of diverse sources, and juxtaposing each other to each other, right? Questioning, all in a sense in the context of another, deep understanding, deep context, and immersion. It's not really possible to immerse in the past, but you could kind of imagine, somehow, somehow that trying to understand, how was it, and feeling these people, it's important, of course they have changed, they got much older. Some of them did not remember what happened 50 years ago, but at the same time, you get a personality, they are still the people who worked at the Broom, and they were all very different, and they were telling me different things, as well. So, yep. Yes. So maybe I'll move to Jogilė's question and then go back to the question about Ukraine, which was very important question, and how all that approach has changed, or would have changed, right? If I wrote the book later, that was what I was asking myself as well. So I kind of responded about emotions to some extent. The important question is whether Broom was dangerous as such, right? And whether humor was a form of containment. So this is just such a prevalent approach. I see it, and especially in political science works, that humor is just to release, your emotions, and it does nothing. I don't see that it does nothing from my own study. I see that it does a lot of things. I really disagree with even classical approaches to humor, that nothing happens. It's just temporal liberation, like in the carnival studies, it's just temporal liberation, exiting from structures, and then you go back to normal. No, I see it as a very rigorous, careful, what I use, post-colonial theory, yes, and use the Rancier's term dissensus to conceptualize how humor is political and how it is transformative. So in that sense, it is shifting discourse. It's redefining communicative patterns. It is rearticulating what matters and what changes. So if we believe that the state can use humor as a form of propaganda, we, I guess, obliged to take the opposite perspective that people also can fight back in a sense, even if it's a banal way, by rearticulating that discourse, right? And recreating it through the state offered venues. So in that sense, humor that was in the Broom was not anti-Soviet, right? We cannot say it was anti-Soviet. It was anti-Soviet in its reception. So this might be not so easy to understand. Of course, they hit some messages, but they couldn't count that people will understand the Zopian language, right? But at the same time, because we have a society, because we have Soviet periphery that is unhappy with Soviet life in general, they read that humor in a particular way. So we have a society that was occupied, that, every third or so family had lost, their members due to that Soviet occupation. So even if many people didn't talk about that, was those traumas, World War II part of the texture. We have a society that is different linguistically, different. They have different religion, although religion is suppressed, and we have society that knows, that it was sovereign, right? That they are different, that they would have lived differently if not for Soviets, and that proximity of the West and East Europe, and the fact that Soviets did allow it more than others, allowed for, and well, that's Putinaitė's work, right? That there were Soviet idioms of being nationalist, right? So they allowed, certain forms of embracing that national identity, created that context in which this humor thrived. And let me just show you a few more slides to illustrate. Oops, to illustrate some of the points that I'm just trying to convey in abstract. So, for example, in Soviet times, comic strips were forbidden, but they were allowed in Lithuania. And comic strips they were considered to be a capitalist genre, totally inappropriate for Soviet people, and they portrayed all kind of things, right? That unacceptable humor for humor's sake, entertainment. But they were able to publish that under kind of the banner that we are criticizing the West. Look what is happening in that rotten West. So people steal, they're unemployed, their soldiers are not heroes, of course, they do all kind of things. There were women, undressed, right, in bikinis running around. So all of this was, how is that possible, to have that kind of humor? But this was allowed, well, they criticized, they banned it, and then they brought it back again, because this was under that kind of guise that we are criticizing the West. Now, people, when you look at the comments, when you talk to people, they collected it. There was no TV, well, no internet at that time, only some people had television. There were no fascinating stories like that. They truly enjoyed that, and their reaction was, we wanted to see the West. We want this entertainment. So this was a kind of an attempt to create Soviet-style comic strips, which nobody liked, and then they returned back to that one. So under that banner, under the banner of, we are criticizing the West, they published all kind of curious things. So in that sense, they openly created sentiments and desires and futures that people craved for. Even if this was the West. I can tell you one quick example. Once Kęstutis Šiaulytis created a cartoon. There is a highway, there are 2 lanes in the highway, and in between there is that median strip where it's just a green strip. He drew cemetery. Presumably, people die a lot, right, in car accidents. So the editor-in-chief said, okay, you can put this into foreign humor section, because in Soviet Union, these things did not happen, right? So they published it as foreign humor. So in that sense, the foreign humor section which was liked most by all readers without basically exception. I don't know anyone who would say, oh, we like something else. They liked that a lot. And under that, foreign humor cover, they communicated ideas about all kind of things. So this is kind of how to create alternatives, right? Alternative futures. And there were lots of criticism. You could see there are no benches, for example, right? Or there's a lot of trash. And Jogilė could tell me, well, this is just trash, right? It's not a real criticism, right? It is just trash, right? But you can also talk about these things in a generalized way. So this is just, they had a museum for items with defects, right? Well, this is one of those critical images sent by people together with verses created about, poem created about it, that did not make into journal. So this could not even be criticized. So you see a coffin being lowered because people, after closing all churches, people did not have where to have those seeings. And they used to have the part of the funeral ceremony in their homes. So this could not publish. This did not get published. I found this in personal archive of the editor-in-chief. But that kind of images were sent. Not all of them got published because they were not accepted. So when I say, this was dangerous, in a sense, through things like foreign humor, right? Through things that were on the border, like through Azopian messages, or also through that criticism that was officially allowed. They created that discourse that was different. And like they criticized environmental issues. And we know very well that that's how the movement which later became Movement for Independence started. So through that venue, they were able to feed into that criticism that existed, and it was co-opted later. It was mobilized later by the nationalist movement. So that is my approach, and in that sense, you cannot control meanings. And in the periphery, we think about the Soviet Union. Well, not we, but many, many those who write about the Soviet Union, you would see that they think about Soviet Union as one, and it was just so different. Ukrainians were also so different. So Lithuanian editor once went to Ukraine, and after a few shots of vodka, he said, "You are occupied and we are occupied." And by the time he got back home, the KGB were already waiting in the Broom offices for him to show up to discuss this, what happened. They drank like crazy, also this was part of that bohemian life, which was also interesting. Yeah, I ran out of time. I know I had more questions, so sorry. It's just that these are such big questions that I was not able to answer all of them.
Thank you, Neringa. I'm glad we still have some time for the audience to ask the questions that are important for them. You can ask questions by raising a hand or writing into the chat. as you wish. Yes. Olga, here you go. Please ask the question.
Hello, and thank you so much for this event. And Neringa, thank you for doing this research and writing this book. I think it's one of the big events of the past few years, really exciting. I have two questions. I don't think they're necessarily related. One is about the lateral connections. I was very glad that you brought it up just a minute ago between editors of humor magazines across Soviet republics. So between, let's say, the Baltics and Central Asia or Ukraine. So how much, I guess, knowledge sharing, best practices, personal connections there were. I don't know if that came up prominently in your interviews, but I would love to know. So that's one question. And the other question is about the use of humor in non-designated humorous spaces, such as, for example, Stengazeta, or the wallpaper, or the red corner in an enterprise. Places that sort of mix genres, as it were, and to what extent that, humor was confined specifically to, I don't know, the particular section, or do you see, let's say, in Naglядная агитация and posters, humor being used in a way that's sort of breaks that frame of, this is where the humor happens, and then everything else is dead serious. So how porous, I guess, is that boundary?
Mm-hmm. Porous boundary, Olga?
Between like spaces where you can joke and then spaces of like actual ideology and propaganda. Particularly visual ideology and propaganda. So like, posters and wallpapers and other sites of Naglядная агитация.
Okay. So yeah, regarding the first question, so this was also very interesting and also telling in a sense about that meaning geographies and humor geographies, because in Crocodile, the majority of editors, they were older. Like Yefimov was there since time immemorial. He lived 100 years through the entire 20th century. And he was creating since 1918 or even earlier. So they were dominated by older people who had very different approach to art itself, to caricature and cartoon. And I addressed to some extent the differences between Broom and Crocodile, but I had to rely primarily on the secondary sources and Crocodile itself, because in the Urgali they don't have Crocodile, and probably either there are no archives or they are not open. But so to say that, there were official events, there were official exhibitions, for example. They participated to some extent in those, but editor-in-chief was invited to Moscow, and they used to go and come back, and used to take sausages and vodka over there when something something that they published something that was not acceptable, but overall everybody tried to assure me that there were no friendships with Moscow artists. And, I kind of take it with a salt of grain. I see in the personal archive of the editor-in-chief that, they communicated with the main editors of Crocodile. But overall, there was a detachment. There were some people who had Crocodile journalist ID, and still, they testify to that, and journalists do. So it was, in a sense, like an island. Their eyes were to the West, Eastern Europe, Western journals. That's what they were excited about. They learned from French. They learned from Danish. They learned from Eastern European, whether that's Hungarian or Polish or Jugendspiele, the East German journal. They were in a very close contact with Estonians. Estonian journal was the most modern journal. also Latvians, not Latvians were mentioned much less, and Ukrainians as well. And, Lithuanians, that's kind of a particular part, were, younger. They were willing, to make changes, to embrace that modernism that was, socialist realism still was the dominant paradigm in Crocodile for many years. So that's kind of and Central Asia, I've never ever heard anybody, I would see them taking pictures, whether there was some kind of exhibition that they participated, but no close contacts with any of them. Anybody reported, or I didn't even see anything. So Eastern Europe was primarily their, kind of point of destination. Now, use of humor. Oh, well, yeah, that's a big question. So the Broom editors were very much in charge of, and that's why I call it an institution. They united all cartoonists, caricaturists, they united artists. They collaborated with them, but also they were part of organizing those exhibitions. And, as that was the last slide that showed up, and then I turned my sharing off, but in 1990, so all artists who collaborated with the Broom gathered and showed into the opposite direction than Lenin himself, and there were 60 of them or so, that used to be the number. That's how many writers also collaborated with the Broom. And they would participate as judges in KVN shows, or so at Agitbrigada, I'm not sure would be the English version of that. They would help with Stengazeta, but where the humor ends, I did not, look into more kind of details into other media, trying to understand that particular question. So cannot answer that, Olga, specifically.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see Katya's hand. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. And it is something that, as a former Soviet subject, as someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, of course, humor was a way of kind of survival and cultural survival and vitality. And it was cultivated mostly, like as you say, in the kitchens through jokes that were passed hand to hand. So it is very enlightening to hear about a kind of an official organ of the Soviet Union that was or the place where local resentments were negotiated through this kind of acceptable form. And so thank you very much for this. I mean, I'm really curious to read about the details, and also, as Julie pointed out, your amazing multi-method kind of approach that is also very refreshing and very interesting, and something that I think we all can learn from. I'm curious about kind of the big picture of how your study might inform and complicate the public narrative or the public memory narrative in Lithuania, and perhaps in sort of across the post-Soviet space, about how we remember the Soviet era, right? And how it might make it less of a kind of one-dimensional story of occupation with violence and political violence and suppression, versus like some kind of misplaced nostalgia, right? How it would give kind of granularity and sophistication to how we remember, or how Lithuanians remember the Soviet past, not as a sort of unrelenting darkness and horror, but as a way of living and making do in those kinds of political conditions. So yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, like, go into the Museum of Occupation in Vilnius, you don't get this idea that, there were, of course, Forest brothers with their literary output and, their sort of community, but you don't get a sense of how Lithuanians, everyday Lithuanians, might have adjusted to the regime, how they may have collaborated with it, perhaps, with some double think like most Soviet citizens did. But that kind of complexity. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts and maybe like a wish list for how, if your book were to be adopted, say, into some kind of school curriculum or into a museum display, how you would convey that story. Thanks.
Thank you, Katya. This is a brilliant question, and it ties to, of course, what Julie asked me about Ukraine. So the story is that the book was finished before February 24th, 2022. And I remember, I was talking to my colleagues and like, what do we do now, right? Because everything changed, the context changed. When the war started. And well, I know that Kathy Warner, she was rewriting her introduction. Mine was about the past. So in a sense, I didn't have to do that. But my book just got translated into the Lithuanian language, and I had, writing every sentence and looking at every sentence, I had to think about this. What if I've written it after the war? Have started, and I wrote in my preface to the Lithuanian translation that there is some kind of peacefulness in the book that probably would not have been, it's still written in such a peaceful and calm tone, that probably would not have been there if the war was already going on. And in that sense, I had the privilege to write it in that time, although, it was post 2014. When, there was no such terrible still anxieties. There were uncertainties about sovereignty and that the war may happen, but it still was not the same. So in that sense, I don't know. It's very hard to answer, right? How else you would write if I imagine I would have emphasized, the colonial, post-colonial, imperial aspects in much more greater extent. So in this context, Katya, my answer is like I feel like in a sense, the book is also the past already, because how will they accept it? Although the book is in the museums, it was eagerly translated, and probably people will read it, I imagine. But in a sense, the history itself redefined, and the emphasis uh, on resistance and fighting is much stronger than it was before 2022, before the book was written. So I'm not sure if it's going to kind of make a big change in how we think about the Soviet period. I believe it will when the war will be over after some time, but not now. Now it's just, it's a different time. So it's the book about the past and maybe for the future, even if it's about the past. But that was one of my intentions, to just add complexity to how we think about the past, because it's kind of sometimes and how we think about some people, through like many artists just stopped drawing because they thought everything is not valued, what they have done in Soviet times. And it's not so. So just talking to them about the past, they were so interested to find out that I might be interested in what they have done, because they kind of crossed that time out, and started either doing something else or yeah. So it could be a form of retrospection, but I don't think it's the time now. But thank you for bringing it up. It's I wish, I wish it was the way you say it, that it could kind of help us think in a more complex way about the past.
Thanks so much.
We might have time for one short question if anyone would like to? Yes.
Thank you very much. So I'm somebody who explored cartoons in the time when everybody's dead. So late 19th century Croatia, part of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. So in that regard, I couldn't apply maybe similar methods as you did, but I'm very inspired. I didn't read your book, but I cannot wait to have it in my hands because I'm also exploring current cartooning in Europe in anti-Muslim sentiments and what was going on after this 12 Mohammed cartoons crisis starting in Denmark. So in what degree political cartoons, this is my passion. I want to hear more about political cartoons. I understand you have also satirical text as a source of laughter and humor. In what degree these political cartoons and drawing in artistic way were original or influenced with what was norm during Soviet era? Or maybe there are some influences coming from the West because political cartooning is a global phenomenon.
Yes.
Maybe you can share more about this. That would be interesting. And thank you so much for the beautiful discussion and conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all really for all the questions and comments. I really appreciate it. Well, they emulated the West primarily. And Eastern European cartoons, Western cartoons. They read French Humanitate. I may mispronounce that journal. There was a journal, and Bidstrup was he was accepted in the Soviet Union as well. The Danish cartoonist was someone they followed as well. So they would read New Yorker. They would read, other journals if they had access to, sometimes in special collections, sometimes through catalogs that they very eagerly wanted to get from the West. And the Soviet influence was very interesting because, of course, there were requirements that pushed them to publish in a particular way, but also the foreign humor section. So they would the foreign humor section where this was the part where one page devoted to just anti-imperialist critique. So not the foreign humor section that I told you about, but anti-imperialist, specifically anti-imperialist critique that had to be published in basically, well, this is just a very bad illustration, but at the back cover they always published something. So it's not even cartoon, some kind of collage, that they experimented with. So this was taken usually from Crocodile because they couldn't invent anything else. They couldn't talk about foreign humor in their own terms. But there were also some curious cases where you could look at that and you could think that they are criticizing actually the Soviet militarism, not foreign militarism. So even in those sections, you could see sometimes Azopian language, and they would get in trouble for that. Yeah. So yeah, primarily Western influence.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really very interesting session. I cannot wait to get your book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll look up your research too. I'll wait for your book in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for participating in this great discussion. I hope that Neringa, we left you with questions and inspirations, and I'm looking forward to that handbook on historical ethnography. I hope that's your next project.
Yes, Julie really helped me to think through those questions. I didn't even think they are somehow relevant. Yeah, thank you all. I really appreciate this seminar and all your input and reading the book. Thank you. It just means a lot to me. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.